All right, now we are live. So let's not do that. Let's go oldest to newest so we actually work off some of our debt that we had. All right, this one, I think we looked at this earlier. Then I had a comment apparently that Stephen responded So he's proposing a brand new type on a concurrent queue where you can effectively control how many elements this thing can ever have before it actually starts to, not block, but effectively returns false, I guess, from try and queue. And then somebody else calls try DQ. And then I think, after a lot of discussion, let me just roll to the bottom. I think Wes asked the question, like, can we make this new constructor on the existing concurrent queue type? And then he said we could, and this is how it would look like. So my gut feel is it's better than adding a brand new type.
That little bullet point's kind of tricky.
Which one?
You want it to spin until there's a space, or you want it to throw because it's full?
I would think that you could have an in queue and try in queue, which seems to be the normal pattern for that.
Well, so it's if we edit the existing type, it already has in queue. And so we can add try in queue, and that would return false if it's full, but the existing thing needs to do something.
Which seems reasonable to me as well.
Which one do we want? Because whatever we pick is wrong.
Why is it wrong?
Because half of our users will want one of them, and half of our users will want the other.
Well, I would say if you don't care, then in that case you just either don't use a bounded capacity or you just call try and queue whatever you want to do. I mean, it's not that we take any scenario away from you, right? I think it's just in the normal realm of expectation when you have an enqueue and a try and queue, the try and queue is just the one that doesn't throw, right?
No, I mean, the concern would be any library that's already taken specifically a concurrent queue as an input. The caller changes the concurrent queue to have a capacity.
Yep, and they're
during their testing, they never actually hit the capacity. Then they send it off somewhere to do something. Which behavior are we giving them? Is the thread dead until they drain it, or?
Sure. I would just say I don't care because I mean, like, the consumer has to opt into this behavior, right? And so if the consumer changes the way the object is being constructed, of course it can change the behavior that you can observe, right? And if the library doesn't work with that mode, then the library doesn't work with that mode. I mean, the alternative is you have a brand new type, so the library doesn't actually use the type at all, right? So you just take more away from the customer. If you just enable the existing thing to work with that.
But there's a lot of times where you pass them as an opaque collection around, not necessarily.
Do you? I don't think you pass around a concurrent collection like as.
Queue is not implementing too many hard interfaces. That's size of normal.
No, I think most of them are actually snapshot semantics too. If you actually get an INUMable, they just, I think at the time you ask for it, the snapshot. I forgot what the semantics were. I think the only one that is interesting is what is it? I produce a consumer collection, whatever. Of T, which is basically the abstraction that you pass around. Yeah. But I think this one already has a trial. What does it look like?
And honestly, it's not that big of a deal. If we find out that there's a huge use case where this pattern doesn't work, we can add the type in the future.
Right.
It's not going to be getting to the bloater if we keep this.
Yeah, I produce a consumer collection. Looks actually fine because it has try add and try take, which is effectively the equivalent of try and queue, try DQ. So that can purely represent that. So I would say the abstraction is even better off than the compute type is. So I would say, you know what?
To array and get enumerator should throw an invalid operation exception.
Yeah, that one seems odd, doesn't it?
Emo, we're not connected to the Skype call.
I tried many times. Here we go. Probably when the machine died, the Skype call died with it.
Ah.
Aha! Sorry, guys. Oh, what is
You should be sorry.
And I am very sorry, but on the upside though, the world could watch earlier before you guys could watch, so I had my priorities right.
I don't know. I mean, the last
Yeah, that one seemed odd.
2 points both concern me.
The first two seem fine to me. Like even the middle one, I don't know what the concern is. Because what else would you do?
I think a new type is better than taking a thing that never had a blocking semantic and adding a blocking semantic, or taking a thing that never had a throwing semantic and adding a throwing semantic. Because the person who's acting with the object may not be the person who constructed it, so they have no idea that this thing happened. And I think that, like, I think either take is acceptable, but we have to pick one. And I think that either of them are a surprise to a library that has never seen this behavior in a queue before. So if we're going to modify concurrent queue, I would expect that when we add the bounded capacity constructor, we add a what do you want to do when it's full mode. Or what do you want in queue to do when it's full mode.
Let me read the beginning first to make sure that we at least understand the last one, because I'm not sure I understand the last one.
Or we just make in queue throw. Let's say switch to try in queue.
Do we have any other bounded data structures today? What is our behaviors?
I don't believe we do.
For the non
We don't artificially bound it.
for the non-concurrent, we can set the initial capacity.
But that just allows it to grow.
Yeah,
That's
that's
not bounded.
yeah.
I feel
That's,
like we have some things that have hard capacity.
Actually, array is a good example because you can totally convert an array to an I list of T, and you can totally call add on that one. And that would just, I think, throw in valid operations. I believe.
That might be where his copy to, etc. are coming from. I don't know why copy to, but
Yeah, that's the thing I don't understand. Like, to me, it's not clear why any of them would have to throw.
What was the proposal if we had a new type? What would it do when it was full? That's always try.
it never has. It doesn't have an in queue. It just has try.
It just returns false when it can't do it.
Okay, methods like try, peek, to array, copy, to get numerator are all require the ability to look at data in the queue without removing it. And in the current implementation, that requires marking the segment as preserving for observation, which means nothing will ever be removed from the queue. This has the effect of continuing to allow end queues until the segment is full, but since the queues don't end up removing data, at that point nothing further can be enqueued even if everything is dequeued. Does anybody understand that? I'm not sure I do.
I think he's saying that the mere fact that you want to peek screws up the concurrency model.
Yeah, it sounds like as if by the mere fact of looking at it, they have to basically mark everything so that effectively you can never ever dequeue. Like, dequeue will never ever remove any elements anymore. So you end up in the world where everything is stuck. Which seems problematic.
Yeah, I mean, try peek feels like it should be able to work, but I could understand.
Okay.
I find the type very, either the type modification or the new type very
What?
confusing. I don't know if it's general purpose or it's just an application problem.
It seems like they could easily implement it on top by just keeping track of the count and don't add anything else to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole type to do that. personally like the idea of just adding up to this stuff, I suppose. Try and queue is a good addition regardless. I think it's probably reasonable, and then for user case, and then you have, if you're constructing as bounded, you can check.
Well, except that try and queue would obviously turn true unless you're bounded, right?
That's right.
So in that sense,
Still
it's not
provides
a
a
very
solution.
useful addition
provides a
unless you block, right? Unless we bounded. I mean, it's more polite, I suppose.
I don't know. To me, this is a reject. This is an application problem, not a developer response.
Which is why I would not create a new type for it, but I would be okay having basically two new 3 members, but the third one is fine.
I think I really don't like the last bullet point, and I don't like this. I like making all the things like this is a collection. Collections can be enumerated, and this collection can't. So there's a new constructor now that says throw during collection operations.
Why can't it be enumerated? I missed that too.
Because implementation detailed things so that the way that concurrent queue is implemented has segments, and the moment anybody wants to read a segment, it says I'm never allowed to erase anything from it again, because I don't know if somebody's still reading off of the segment. And the whole point of his bounded thing is he won't ever create a second segment. So he has to not support. This is in preserved read mode.
Well, I mean, you can't erase, but you can track where the current index is.
You should be able to make a copy of it. Too.
Yeah, I mean, I would think a better solution would be, copy 2 can just lock longer and get a numerator, fine, you're in bounded mode, it allocates. Yeah, it clones the data and.
I think I'm not sure how the concurrent collection works. My understanding is they're non-blocking.
They generally try to spin, but I don't think they're not blocking in all cases.
No, I think they are blocking in the case when what was the other one? The producer consumer one, where you basically, like when the consumer is asking but nothing is in it, right? Then it would start to block. But I think the general access pattern is block free. Which would now mean that if you have to log for these things, well, now you may have to use deadlocks in the system. Right?
Would you have to lock for it though? Because if you don't have to worry about resizing and you just have the one array of elements, then all you have to do to track the current element is to update the index, and you can track that in the enumerator for this is the index I was on, and if it's ever changed.
Well, from reading the introduction, it sounds like his problem is that the internal implementation is like segmented somehow, and in order for him to keep track of what's in use and what's not in use, he has to basically mark these things as don't remove them because currently somebody is looking at them, which now means that by just looking at them, you might end up in a world where you can no longer, like basically DQ can no longer physically remove anything, so you now run out of slots, even though so like at some point somebody would have to say, okay, screw it, somebody's asking for data like 2 array, I copy, but in that time frame nobody else can NQ or DQ, otherwise we run into this issue where we run out of slots. And now you would introduce a lock somewhere in that system, right?
So you're either breaking the behavior of the existing applications or modifying the performance of existing applications, or effectively we have one public type that has 2 different implementations inside, which means it's 2 types for one thing. Ooh, we added union.
Okay, so let me just bounce this back. So that might not be the right description, but he's a smart guy. So. We will figure this out.
He won't do that from other stuff.
Oh yeah, one thing off the list. I think we want to skip this one because that's a whole different part of the discussion. Which no, this one, oh, leave it.
What's the longer discussion on the half one?
Isn't that part of the whole?
Well, so there's the external discussion on like what does ML.NET need. This one in particular is adding it for the hardware intrinsic support, and it's basically just saying add an opaque type with basic support for converting to and from single.
Do we have the right people in the room to review this? I would probably.
We have one of the right people in the room to
We have the
review
only person
it.
in our team that's.
There's potentially other people that could be in the room to review it.
Which I think would
Yeah.
probably be good.
Okay.
And plus, this type is not exactly what I would consider like a triage level review, because it seems there's a lot of context.
Yeah.
Which probably takes half an hour just to give you the context. So that's why I would skip it for now.
All right.
Like this is the kind of thing that gets you in trouble. That is the kind of thing that I think is good for triage, because you know it's one method, and if Levi can explain to us in 5 minutes what this is about,
I actually I thought this had gotten rejected, to be honest, because it doesn't work on it doesn't work outside of core CLR. The idea is it's just a way to take an arbitrary field and turn it into a span of byte. Like say that you want the span of byte representation of an integer without copying. Stuff like that.
I already had that understanding.
don't we have this on unsafe?
Yeah, unsave as
You can take a span of int and memory marshal.asBytes lets you take like a span of int and turn it into a span of byte, but I'm not sure about anything that will let you take an arbitrary field and turn it into a span of byte.
I thought you could pass in ref t and 1 for arbitrary fields on one of the APIs.
You can get a span of t that way.
Yeah, and
That's
then
what
you
I
can use memory marshal to
see.
convert from span of t to span of byte.
Does a span of t constructor take ref as a parameter?
I don't
Oh
think the
no, memory
constructor does.
marshal.create span.
Yeah, it's memory marshal create span, and then there's another API that converts from span of t to span
I
of
don't have it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
u.
as I said, we don't index it anymore.
So I think
that
you
might
could,
that might.
I
Yeah,
think
but
you
this thing
could
has
create
not
a
been indexed
wrapper
in, like,
today.
Yeah.
Weeks. Why would it disappear? Anyway,
Okay.
so we already have that API?
So we have you have to jump through a few hoops, but it is possible today, it seems. And the hoops that you would have to jump through are memory marshal.create read-only or memory marshal.create span over the ref itself, and then memory marshal.asBytes to turn the span of t into a span of byte. So okay, 2 calls. That's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Alternatively, you could call an API called asBytes, which is just a new specific takes left key.
Sorry.
Like you could overload asBytes.
Yeah, so that's kind of.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's the it's .cast, not 2 bytes. Memory marshal .cast will let you do it.
So which one? Memory marshal?
Oh, you can do create from span and then cast to turn from span of t to span of u.
I see.
Or just use the.
Yeah. Is there an asBytes? Yes, there is.
I was going to say, we reviewed this one. We approved it. It's done. Which would now mean the other one is no longer required, right?
Yeah.
This is going the opposite direction.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
This is the wrong direction.
This already exists, the asref.
So it went the other way, give from T.
Yeah, Again,
Yeah, it's already there.
You can
And
do it
even in the comments, it's equivalent to this on cast. I don't know if it's into a span.
you can do it with 2 calls right now. I don't know the additional one, because
Yeah.
no one should be doing it.
Does that make sense to you? So then,
Checked it.
yeah. Which no means we effectively have the same problem right there.
Yeah, if it turns out that this is a common pattern, then we can reconsider this.
Let's hope it's not.
Yeah.
Bam! 2 off the list.
For all the ARM6 comments, we're trying to gather them up, or should
Yes,
we
I
nonetheless
still have it
right
on my
now?
list. I still have not done my homework. I'm a bad, bad boy. And I should feel ashamed of myself. And I do. Every time I use my computer is also slow. I think my computer is seeking revenge. So. Okay, I still don't know what this is, and I still don't know what I want it this way, but. Okay. Burdensome them to answer my question. Add MaxHttpVersion. I think we looked at this last time, right?
We did, yes.
Said, please know if you why would we add the to the basin? Oh yeah, that's the one. There's an abstract that only has to send anything which we could add it to the client. It has to be that with the other opportunities, yeah. Also done. No. Yeah, that's the one I meant, I think. So if I'm parsing him right, he's effectively agreeing with 2 and 3, right? Except that 3 doesn't exist, right? There's no global one. I think the one that he refers to, I think, is an instance property. I can check though. Yes, it's an instance property, which is probably not super helpful, because if you're using HTTP client directly, then it will, you don't get to control the one that is being used effectively. So if we add this to the client handler, isn't the client handler the one that is just the wrapper?
It doesn't do a whole lot.
Because then, how would you get to take the thing and plumb it through?
So for number 3, it would be that we should make the HTTP request message the default version as a settable static. That doesn't solve the you want it on a per host problem.
Right. At which point you just what? Yeah, it kind of seems like you really want it on the HTTP client, right? Or whoever constructs the messages for you. Because that one has the right granularity. The global versus instance one on that one is more convenience than anything else. But if you only have it on HTTP request message, then, well, you can effectively no longer use anything in HTTP client unless you control the construction of the message, right? Or you would have to, I don't know, there's probably some global thing you can derive from an override and then just mess with that thing before it actually hits the pipe. But I'm not sure that's the best way to do that. Okay, that's a very lengthy reply from Jeff.
Yeah.
Windows 22 over. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. The fact that it defaults to 2 is a scary thing, I suppose.
Well, it's down to the agree to the API that was already proposed. Put it on HTTP socket and.
Yeah, exactly. I very strongly think that no one should ever need to write the word sockets handler. Like everybody always gets confused. They're like, "Oh, I'm using HTTP client. How do I use the client authentication certificate?" It's like, well, back up. First, yeah, you need to go know what a handler is. You need to make a handler. You need to set the permissions on the handler. Like the HTTP client should be the place where people make the modifications to their client things. All of the handler stuff should be about very weird things. Not necessarily because that's the way they designed it, but that's because of the way that the users understand it. They just interoperate with they talk to HTTP client, it does stuff.
So I agree with you.
So it's discoverability. That's the issue.
And
I didn't mean to interrupt.
yeah,
sorry.
so I mean, you can't get the handler back out once it goes in. Right. So you need to know pre-construction time that you need to do something weird. And for a lot of people, they're torn from that state. They can't do anything about it. And there's a weird question of ownership, like, can you ever accept an HTTP client and an API meaningfully? Because someone's configured a handler the way that they want it to work, but maybe you need to do something different. So I still think that if the whole point is, oh, but there's a server out here that maybe didn't do HTTP2 the way that we expected it to, that's a concern for sockets and the HTTP client, therefore it belongs on the client, not on the handler. Because now it's a problem about talking to this host.
Do you understand David's comment? Because he's basically saying it doesn't belong on SocketsHandler, and then he concludes, but for now I'm fine adding it to the socket section. It seems like, what? I just read your whole thing and you just made a very compelling case why it should be an HTTP client.
They're arguing that it should go on the HTTP client handler. And there's another follow-up issue also asking to put it onto that.
I could go see if David's in his office when you bring him in.
That might be useful actually.
Yeah, okay. I'll be right back.
Because then we can at least close on this one.
Yeah.
I mean, HTTP client handler is at least better than putting it on sockets handler.
Just let him know that we record, so he doesn't.
Yeah, I'll tell him.
Yeah. It's always something to bring in people that don't know we're recording, and then they start to vent about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. All right. So, meanwhile, I'm reading more. Isn't it funny how a single property can result in so many comments?
I think there's also a big debate about the design of the overall system. Who's in control of which pieces?
Yeah, so somebody recently did this diagram, right, where they, what was it, HTTP, what was that, message handler, I think is the abstract base, right? I'm saying it looks roughly like this. And you have HTTP client handler, which I believe the idea here is that this guy aggregates one of those guys.
Well, apparently, I think it should go on HTTP message handler. Not HTTP client.
Sorry, what? So is this the correct design? Like, is this the correct?
HTTP client
This is the
handler
handler
extends
structure.
HTTP message handler, yes.
Okay.
I agree.
Well, we're trying to understand.
That's
how
going to
it
show up well on
works.
the stream.
Well, for now, and I'm just trying to understand what it is. Socket H, what is it called? Socket HTTP handler? Or? Is this true?
Yeah, it's called SocketsHttpHandler, but I think that one.
Sockets. I'm bringing David in, by the way.
Yeah. I believe that is the right direction. Let me quickly verify that.
Hello.
Hi, David, this is
David.
the room.
Yes, I'm the room. I hello room. Hola.
So, Ema?
So that seems right. Let me, yeah, 1 second. All right, so we're looking at issue 30527, the one where we want to add the default HTTP property, and the question is where to put it. You see the screen? I think you do, right?
Yes, I can see the screen.
Yeah.
So there's a long discussion about it with my comments and Jeff's, etc. So what are the particular questions?
So what I'm not entirely sure, so like it went back and forth. So like this comment from you in particular, where you basically say it doesn't belong on HTTP client itself, it would belong on the client handler. And so what I'm trying to understand is like, so my understanding of the client handler is that it wraps effectively other message handlers.
Well, not necessarily. In the implementation of with the way we did changing the plumbing of how HTTP client handler works for .NET Core, we created this thing called Sockets HTTP Handler, sort of following the model we did with WinHTTP Handler and curl handler.
Right.
In fact, with curl handler, we didn't really expose that publicly, but the idea was that HTTP client handler itself, as followed from the framework, was the public class where all the knobs are for the protocol stack. And as we did these other handlers like WinHTTP Handler and Sockets HTTP Handler, we sort of went down a path of, well, maybe we need these other APIs on these sort of platform-specific handlers, more knobs, etc. But traditionally, the knobs are always on the handler. They're not actually on the HTTP client class itself. Is that sort of the context of the question?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think like last time we talked about this, and I think I did not do the best job writing that up. But basically, the idea was, I think, to say it doesn't belong in a particular implementation, right? So like Socket HTTP handler seems the wrong way to do that because it seems other handlers have the same desire, meaning they want to control the HTTP version that is burned into the message by HTTP client, right? So
well, yeah. So yes, and so the final intent would be that we would add this property to HTTP client handler. We did not. We have another issue for that. We didn't propose that right away because there are several other properties that we added to Sockets HTTP handler while we were developing it, and they were sort of a way for developers to start playing around with the new handler. And we weren't sure if some of those other properties we added, and I referenced some of those in this discussion about the connection lease timeout and the pool lifetime, etc. Some really low-level knobs, and we weren't sure whether or not those made sense on HTTP client handler, especially that it may be difficult to have those actually work on other implementations of the class.
Right.
If we think, originally we thought of framework, but if we think of Mono or Xamarin, etc. And so because we were just getting early mileage on Sockets HTTP handler, we really wanted a way to have the knobs there first, and then if we thought they really were very useful, we would then consider promoting them, and putting them on HTTP client handler so that that's where they were for the long haul.
Right.
And that was sort of the thought process, and that's what we've done already with a few properties on Sockets HTTP handler. And because HTTP 2 protocol is really a new thing for the handler, and we're still getting still understanding what it means to implement it in that handler, we wanted to at least have this programmatic API just on that handler before we commit to putting it on HTTP client handler.
So to me, this is solving the wrong problem. To me, this is like the max shouldn't exist. The only question is what should the default be? And so
Well,
either the default needs to be static settable on the HTTP message, which seems wrong because statics mean that multi-threaded applications don't work, or that the client, where the message handler has a what is the default version I use when you call the constructors on, or when you call the methods on client that take a URI instead of a message. So,
well, so let me discuss that comment and the history of how this MaxVersion property was proposed to be on the handler. Originally, the version property that does exist today on the HTTP request message as an instance property, and the default for a long time had been 1.1. And when we first thought about this for on the WinRT APIs, we added we needed a mechanism to one, move the default forward for convenience, because many of the HTTP client APIs don't actually take an HTTP request message object. They simply take a URI. So APIs like getAsync, postAsync, they don't take a request message. A developer doesn't build an HTTP request message. So then we had the issue of, well, many developers were saying, why doesn't your stack use HTTP2 since you're adding it? And so we decided many months ago to push the default of HTTP request message.version to 2.0. We did this because we had HTTP2 protocol support on Windows with WinHTTpHandler. We had it on Linux with curl handler. So we made the decision to push that forward already so that the default, except on framework, the default would be 2.0. So when developers use the convenience APIs on HTTP client, like getAsync, postAsync, they would start talking HTTP2, or at least proposing to a server that they supported HTTP2.
Right.
The reason why we thought about adding this property at all to the handlers was because of our experience with WinRT, with the Windows Web HTTP APIs, where we discovered that some servers might have a problem with getting the HTTP2 protocol proposed via the ALPN negotiation mechanism, and we needed a mechanism to potentially cap that version. So while the default might be 2.0, say for the Windows Web HTTP APIs on that handler property, we gave developers the option to dial it down so that it would sort of have a cap. And that same philosophy was what we went with on proposing this property for SocketsHttpHandler. We've already moved the default 2.0, which is the right thing for most cases. But in the rare cases where developers have a problem communicating with legacy servers, we wanted this property to be able to dial it back and cap it so that it would be capped at 1.1.
So that makes sense, but then how would a consumer who effectively just uses HTTP client with a default constructor and doesn't deal with handlers at all, how would they dial it back then? Do they now have to know which handler to instantiate?
So in that case, they can't. If they don't deal with handlers, meaning they just say new HTTP client, so it's going to use the default of building them an HTTP client handler underneath, and it will use the default set of values. And if they don't even they don't even create an HTTP request message, then yeah, they're going to get 2.0, assuming that the max version on the handler is 2.0. Initially, we were proposing here because of our sort of cautious nature to just make it 1.1, etc. But yeah, you're right. I mean, so in the default set of cases, but in the 90% cases, having 2.0 is the right thing. It'll work in the majority of cases, and it's only in the rare set of cases where a developer is doing some communication to some legacy set of servers that, yes, they will have to create a handler, set the max version, to 1.1, and then talk to that legacy server.
Yeah,
and that was sort of an expected mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the question is more like, so if we buy the scenario where we say somebody using HTTP client directly without knowing the handler needs to be able to dial it back, then eventually we would need a design where the HTTP message handler, or part of the abstraction of the communication between HTTP client and the handler has a way to control that. At which point, if we now expose a non-virtual, non-abstracted property on sockets handler, we would now have to figure out how the new thing that we will add later, that is actually part of the abstractions, would basically play with this new property on the side, right? Like then they all have to agree or make sense at some point, right? In which case, adding this now on sockets handler might just create that later on we have to somehow reconcile with the rest of the abstractions.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that concerns me a bit. So if we believe it never belongs into the abstractions, it's purely a sockets thing, and then clearly that's where it belongs. If we believe it's just a stopgap and eventually we will fix the larger problem, then I'm somewhat more opposed because we just add that we then have to reconcile.
Because to me,
We're definitely going to want to add it eventually to HTTP client handler. So first of all, adding it to sockets HTTP handler is a stopgap. Having the class public at all is a stopgap. In some ways, we didn't necessarily even have to expose sockets HTTP handler as a public API because our intent was always for people just to use HTTP client handler. The plumbing underneath it was sort of an implementation detail. But we chose a path of exposing sockets HTTP handler because we wanted to get early mileage on the class and especially for people that might use the other mechanisms to revert back to the other stack, they needed a mechanism to opt in back to sockets HTTP handler. The intent of the API for many years has been that you build, if you need to adjust knobs for HTTP client, you create the HTTP client handler, and then you adjust the knobs on it. And that sort of is has been the standard API pattern. So yes, adding this property to sockets HTTP handler would be a stopgap, much like the other two properties that we've already added to sockets HTTP handler about the least timeouts on connections. The final thing would be perhaps we would add it to HTTP client handler. I don't see a downside of adding this to sockets HTTP handler because we've already passed the precedent of adding a couple of knobs to sockets HTTP handler. It's sort of giving us just a quick way to get programmatic mileage on building the HTTP2 support in the handler. And we already have this API where we exposed the handler, the sockets HTTP handler, and so we wanted to add the Max version to sockets HTTP handler without yet committing to the HTTP client handler yet.
So I suppose if we never need to have it virtual, I think it's fine because we can always remove the one on the sockets handler if we add the same property on the base type because that's binary compatible. But
yes. I don't know where the virtual thing came in. To my knowledge, we've never proposed it to be a virtual thing.
Okay, in that case, then I
so
think I'm
to me, if we go back and we look at people who are they say new HTTP client, they don't know what a handler is. They use the default constructor because that's the easiest thing to use, and they're using the URI based calls because that's what they do. To me, this should just be an instance property on HTTP client of what is the default HTTP version I will speak of if you call the convenience method. And if they hit a server that doesn't support it, they change it to 1.1. And that solves it for WinRT, that solves it for sockets, that solves it for any future handler. It solves the user scenario without caring what the technical reason we're adding it right now is.
So the only comment I'll make on that is that historically, we've never put any of those kind of knobs on HTTP client itself. In fact, HTTP client is a derived class of a class called HTTP message invoker. And HTTP message invoker is sort of, that is like the base class, and that has one ability, and it's to call the send a sync API, which really just calls the handler. And so HTTP client is this class that people use, and it gives them a little value add above HTTP message invoker, and the value add is a set of convenience methods like get async, post async, and also a couple of mechanisms of buffering response content, whereas the handler itself or the HTTP message invoker class never actually drains the response body. So, HTTP client has been the thing people use, but we've never thought about having these knobs, these properties at all on HTTP client. The only property we do have on HTTP client is sort of the timeout, which is this overall timeout thing. So we would be going down a new path, and I'm not to say that we absolutely shouldn't, but we would be going down a new path of adding a knob to the HTTP client class itself, which is something we really haven't done.
Well, you already have default request headers and max response content buffer size, for
And
example,
the
right?
scenario is HTTP client is the one creating these messages. It is specifically the convenience overloads in HTTP client that creates an HTTP request message. And I just say that HTTP client should have a what is my default version, and it assigns it on the HTTP request messages that it creates.
So the only other thing I'll say to sort of push back a little bit on that is when HTTP client was designed and the whole handler model was designed, HTTP client tried to make the HTTP protocol itself sort of a first-class thing for responses and headers, but things that were like transport semantics like SSL or connection things, it wasn't really appropriate for the object model scope of what HTTP client was. Because HTTP client, in a sense, would actually have these request and responses and headers be this sort of more abstract thing. And in actuality, HTTP, even though we're overloading the version field, the version field, unfortunately, is more of a transport thing. And the only example I'll give you is the slight difference we have in the WinRT API. In the WinRT API, there is no version property at all for the HTTP request message. Windows Web HTTP namespace, the HTTP request message, which looks very much like SystemNet because we designed that at the same time, doesn't even have a version property in that. And that was done for some other random reasons about how the protocol stack that it used, which was Win9net, sort of works. So, and so HTTP2 isn't, you don't even specify that version on the HTTP request line. So the actual protocol is the same. It still is HTTP 1.1. So it's kind of a semantics thing about object model stuff. So I'm pushing back on adding it to HTTP client because it just puts us into this new space of adding these knobs that are more discrete, more connection-oriented semantics, and takes us away from sort of the more abstract model of what HTTP protocol is. So that's just sort of why I'm pushing back on adding it to HTTP client right now.
I mean, I'm fine with that. I think I can live with the fact that it's not sockets handler because I know how to reconcile it later with the, message handler. I would just say that maybe we should wait for some more customer feedback. I mean, I don't know how long it will take for the ecosystem to catch up with HTTP2. Maybe that's a problem that just disappears relatively quickly. But if that becomes similar to IPv4 versus IPv6, where it basically will take another decade until everybody talks IPv6, then maybe we will find ourselves that many of our customers end up having to cap the HTTP version, in which case we probably should expose it on the handler just to make it a lot more convenient. Because as soon as you say you need to do with the handler, you kind of derail the primary value add of the convenience constructor, which is by far the most commonly used constructor as far as I can tell.
Well, let me devil's advocate that argument real fast. Like as more and more people move to like a cloud hosting model, imagine Azure, AWS, whatever, where you have some type of shared hosting infrastructure, you can imagine that the hosts are enabling HTTP2 on their customers' behalf at that point, right?
So I say this last part again there.
So you can imagine that I as a customer just have an application running in like Azure websites, for instance,
right? And
maybe they just enable HTTP2 without me taking any action. Like now, all of a sudden, you see this very large number of applications which get upgraded all at once because the underlying hoster has decided to upgrade to HTTP2. Right. So the reason that I mention this is it talks to your argument about how long is it going to take for HTTP2 to catch on.
Right.
Like I think it's not really going to be a gradual thing. I think what we'll actually see is like some large vertical climbs where we see entire classes of applications go all at once.
I mean, your argument is almost like it's advocating for we should make it less discoverable to cap the HTTP version because
No. I wasn't trying to make that argument. I was just saying, like, if we put this off and ask, well, what does the data say in a few years? I think we're going to see the data much more quickly than that. Okay. Like, I think we're going to be affected by it more quickly.
Right. So I just want to add one follow-on comment to that. Like I said, the 90% cases that people shouldn't have to cap the version and the default if the default was 2.0, it should work in 90% of the cases. You know, the 2.0 sort of gets sent and first of all, it's only for SSL connections, because that's really all we do for HTTP2 communication anyway. We only support via TLS. And so it's something that gets sent on this TLS ALPN, and a lot of most servers will simply either ignore that ALPN negotiation or respond back saying, hey, you know, I'm only doing 1.1. So in the 90% case, having the version default to 2.0 as what is proposed is fine, because a lot of servers that don't support HTTP2 are just going to talk 1.1 anyway. We only wanted this property on there to handle customers that then come back and say, I'm broken. You started talking HTTP2. I'm talking to a really legacy server or an appliance, a piece of hardware that really can't even deal with this other thing on the ALPN, on the TLS thing. I need a way for you to stop proposing HTTP2 all the time. And so this is why the property was going to exist.
I still think it should be default version on the client. If somebody wants to create a message themselves, we should respect the version and not downgrade it unless we simply don't understand it. And I don't think that the max version on a handler makes any sense as an API design. It's do what the message says, and we should fix it at the problem, which is who created the message, which is the client.
David, you mentioned earlier that historically we haven't really put properties like this on HTTP client itself. Is there anything that we should have as a consideration if we were to suggest that that's the place where it belongs? I know that you had mentioned earlier about, you know, it kind of corrupts the object model a little bit because now it's no longer representing this abstraction. But were there any other concerns we should have?
No, I mean, it's keeping the intent of the design, the original design of what the class was meant for. I mean, for example, if you only add it to HTTP client, then if someone uses HTTP Message Invoker, which is the base class of HTTP client, then they're not even going to have this property.
Right, but they built the HTTP message themselves. So all I'm proposing is changing the accelerator methods on HTTP client to so that there's an instance property on the client that sets the version of the message objects it builds. And that's all.
Right. So,
I think that's the scenario.
Okay, I understand that, but in order to make it work, in order to add it as a property to HTTP client, you will have to be able to pass it into the handlers.
No. I'm not suggesting a maximum. I'm suggesting the default in all the convenience methods that say new HTTP message or HTTP request message, whatever it is, that they would then assign the version. That's it. That's what I think this API should be. No maximum, no fallback, no rewrite things, no just change the factory.
Okay, so you're saying that that only affects saying that only affects the automatically generated HTTP request messages when you use those methods.
Right. I think that would solve the user problem of when I talk to this host, things go wrong. And then they would say, oh, well, it's only causing this problem when I call getAsync that takes a URI. Oh, I just changed default version to 1.1 and now everything's happy.
We're out of time, so I would say I can see two options. So we can either leave the property as it's proposed right now here, which seems like is generally a good thing regardless of whether we expose it in HTTP client. Anybody agreeing with that?
I don't agree with that.
So okay, let's say we do expose it in HTTP client. Why would you not also expose it on the handler?
I don't think so. To me, the scenario of telling the handler, I don't care what I told you, your maximum you should do is 1.1. That's the wrong layer. You should fix the people who are creating the messages. If the server,
I agree that if we're going to
that's different.
Add it on the client, then we don't necessarily need it adding it to the handler. But But if somebody manually I guess the question I have is if somebody manually creates an HTTP request message, which they do today, and they call the send a sync method of HTTP client, then this property you're setting on HTTP client doesn't do anything because the default when you do a new HTTP request message is to set the version to 2.0. So we'll just have to explain to people that, okay, if you do that and you set HTTP client's property to some other thing, then it won't affect the manually created HTTP request messages. And that could be confusing to customers because now you're setting a property on HTTP client and you're calling like send a sync, and it's not going to have any effect because you manually created the HTTP request message.
I think
That may be confusing.
I think if it's called default version and the documentation says the version to use for all the overloads that don't take an HTTP request message, that's pretty simple.
Right. So then the property couldn't be like MaxHttpVersion. It would have to be like default.
Yeah, that's specifically my recommendation is that it be default and it change the factory and there be no filtering in the client layer and there be no filtering in the handler layer aside from things that the handler simply doesn't understand. That is what I think solves the user scenario with the user scenario API instead of solving the technical problem by making users understand our implementation details.
Okay, I hear you. So then it would be HTTP client, and the property would be like default HTTP version.
Yep.
And then we could decide that that the default value of that property is say 2.0, but someone can dial it back to 1.1.
Yep.
Emo, you said that there was a default timeout property on HTTP client, right?
No, there's just timeout and there's default request headers or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In terms of the name. Yeah. And so if we want to discuss what the name of the property should be on HTTP client, the only problem, we'd want the name of the property to tell people that it's only affecting the APIs where you don't explicitly pass in an HTTP request message.
Right.
So maybe using the word default is a better part of the name.
I just think that we should identify the user scenario and make sure we're solving it correctly instead of just solving our technical problem.
So are you punting this back as needs work then? Is that the idea?
If we, independent of the user problem, think that there's a reason to cap handlers, that I just don't think there's a reason if we fix the issue. And then I'm just trying to, I guess, channel Christoph's minimalist surface area.
I was supposed to bring my site to today's meeting.
So what will be the final disposition of this? Are you kicking it back to have us?
So I just wrote it up. So like I just copy and pasted like everything that we just talked about, and maybe typos in it because I'm out of time. But basically at the very end it has Barton's or Jeremy's proposal that basically says expose HTTP client default HTTP version, which would control what the default value for request message object group that are constructed, and that would basically mean that you don't get a global cap. It would just be you control what the defaults are, and if the user wants to do a cap, well then they have to themselves be careful, whether they construct HTTP request messages by hand or whether they just use HTTP client with the factory methods effectively.
And specifically, that's an instance.
Sorry, yes, that's kind of implied, but I understand that, but yes. All right, so I kick this back as needs work, and then Jeremy and David, please talk about this online and close on it so we can get this done. And now I'm out of time, so I have to stop streaming now. There's another meeting I have to be at. Alrighty. Thanks, guys, online.
Okay.
Bye, Internet.
And that's how API reviews work.